The moment William Barr lost his composure, the entire chamber froze. His voice, usually cloaked in calm calculation, burst forth with a thunder that rattled the very air. He leaned forward, his face a shade redder than usual, his jaw clenched, and he screamed words that reverberated off marble walls like cannon fire. It was raw, it was unrestrained, and it was unmistakably unhinged. Gasps spread through the chamber like a shockwave. Aides stopped writing. Lawmakers glanced nervously at one another, their eyes wide as if to confirm they had all heard the same eruption. Even the faint shuffle of papers halted, leaving behind a silence that felt both stunned and dangerous. For a man who had once sat at the pinnacle of Washington power, Barr's roar carried not the weight of authority, but the desperation of someone grasping to regain control. It wasn't just the volume, it was the venom, the sneer in his voice, the attempt to intimidate rather than persuade, the naked hostility directed toward Jasmine Crockett across the table. Barr, who had built a career on sharp legal maneuvering and carefully crafted arguments, was abandoning that persona. Instead, he reached for brute force, the power of a raised voice to overwhelm, to silence, to dominate. But as his words echoed into silence, it became clear he had miscalculated. The chamber did not bow. It froze, it waited, and in that tense stillness, Barr looked less like a statesman and more like a man unraveling under the lights. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She didn't even break her gaze. Her posture remained steady, her hands folded calmly in front of her, her eyes unshaken by the storm that had just erupted. If Barr embodied noise, Crockett embodied silence, a silence sharper and more dangerous than any shouted insult. The cameras zoomed in, catching her stillness. In that moment, she seemed almost statuesque, the embodiment of unyielding calm in the face of fury. Barr's scream filled the air, but her silence filled the room. And beyond those walls, millions were watching, waiting, wondering. Because the question was no longer what had Barr said. The question was, how would Crockett respond? But what happened next would not only silence Barr, it would ignite a firestorm across the nation. The explosion inside that chamber was not just a slip of temper, it was a fracture, a moment when the mask slipped and the machinery of power revealed its true face. William Barr's scream wasn't simply directed at Jasmine Crockett. It was aimed at something bigger, the very presence of a young black congresswoman who dared to meet him eye to eye, who dared to challenge his version of reality. His outburst was a message, know your place, and that is why the silence afterward was so heavy, so unforgettable. Everyone in that room knew a line had been crossed. Across America, people felt the weight of it instantly. The clip replayed online in seconds, audiences parsing every syllable, every grimace, every gasp. It wasn't just a heated exchange, it was a collision of worlds. On one side, the towering figure of the establishment, cloaked in decades of privilege and power. On the other, a freshman congresswoman who represented something Washington had always tried to push to the margins. Unfiltered truth, carried with dignity, sharpened by struggle. For Barr, this wasn't just another skirmish. He was used to jousting with journalists, dismissing critics, brushing aside challenges with the cold assurance of someone convinced the system was built to protect him. But here, his scream betrayed more than anger. It betrayed fear, because for once his bluster was not met with retreat. It was met with calm, steady eyes that refused to blink, and that's what made this moment so dangerous, so explosive. Barr had decades of institutional weight behind him, law firms, political allies, pundits eager to spin his narrative. Crockett had something different. She carried the lived reality of communities who had been dismissed, shouted down, erased from the national story. Her presence at that table was not just her own victory, it was the victory of every underestimated voice that had ever fought to be heard. That's why millions latched onto this moment. It wasn't just about what was said, but about what it represented. For immigrants who had been too old to go back, for women silenced in boardrooms, for black Americans forced to fight twice as hard for half the recognition, this was a mirror. Barr's scream was the voice of an old order. Crockett's silence was the strength of a new one rising. But anticipation buzzed through the chamber like static. The stakes had been set higher than anyone had anticipated. Barr had delivered his explosion. The cameras had captured his fury. But what would Crockett do with the silence that followed? Would she let the roar linger, or would she seize it, shape it, turn it back against him? She had been underestimated before. Critics wrote her off as too blunt, too passionate, too unwilling to play by Washington's rules. Yet that underestimation had become her greatest strength, because while others tried to navigate the system as it was, Crockett represented those who demanded the system change. And on this day, with the world watching, she had a chance to prove that truth could still outshine spin. Barr thought the moment belonged to him, but in reality, he had handed her the perfect stage. And in that stillness after his scream, America held its breath. To understand why Barr's outburst mattered, you have to understand the man behind it. William Barr was not just any Washington figure. He had been the quiet architect of power games for decades, wielding influence like a scalpel when others swung hammers. He rose through the corridors of government as a strategist, a fixer, the man you called when you needed legality bent into a shield, and for years it worked. To many in power, Barr was invaluable precisely because he cloaked their interests in the language of law. His first stint as Attorney General in the early 1990s gave him a reputation for loyalty to executive authority, for expanding presidential power with a calm confidence that others mistook for principle. When he returned decades later under Donald Trump, critics saw it as the final confirmation. Barr was not a neutral guardian of justice. He was a political warrior, willing to bend institutions to protect the powerful. His defenders praised his intellect, but his opponents called him something else: a shield, a smokescreen, a man who believed the rules were meant for others, not for him. Scandal after scandal passed through his hands. He was accused of spinning the Mueller report to minimize its impact, of using the Department of Justice as a political weapon, of excusing abuses of power under the guise of unitary executive theory. In the eyes of critics, he didn't just defend corruption, he rationalized it, and he did it with a smugness that suggested he believed no one could touch him. That's the man who screamed. A man long used to control, long used to walking into hearings knowing the balance of power tilted his way. Barr's entitlement wasn't just political, it was personal. He carried himself with the quiet certainty that he was smarter, savvier, more protected than anyone who dared question him. And for years, that certainty had proven correct, but beneath the polished exterior lay contradictions. He styled himself as a defender of law and order, yet bent the law whenever it served his allies. He projected calm authority, yet here he was, screaming in frustration. His reputation for careful legal maneuvering had collapsed into raw noise. And in that collapse, you could see the truth. His power was never about principle. It was about preserving a system that served men like him. That's why the clash with Jasmine Crockett mattered so much. He didn't see her as just another lawmaker. He saw her as a threat to the very order he had spent his life defending. A black woman with sharp legal credentials, unafraid of his reputation, unwilling to shrink under his voice. She was everything that undercut his sense of untouchable dominance. And so, he screamed. It wasn't just anger. It was the sound of entitlement colliding with resistance. The sound of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time, that his bluster would not be enough. Yet for all his influence, Barr was about to face something he had never anticipated, a voice that cut sharper than his rage. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's silence carried such weight in that chamber, you have to know who she is, and what forged her into the kind of woman who could stare down William Barr without flinching. Her story doesn't begin in Washington. It begins far from the marble columns and polished hallways of Congress. It begins in a world where being overlooked was normal, where being doubted was routine, and where resilience was not an option but a survival skill. Born and raised in Dallas, Texas, Crockett knew early on what it meant to be underestimated. The daughter of working-class parents, she grew up in a world that rarely handed opportunities to people who looked like her. She learned quickly that her voice would not be freely given space. It had to be carved out, demanded, defended. That lesson shaped everything that came after. From classrooms where teachers expected her to stay quiet, to law schools where her presence was questioned, Crockett discovered that her strength lay not in softening who she was, but in sharpening it. She carried that sharpness into her legal career, where she built a reputation as a fierce defender of the voiceless. She represented clients who couldn't afford powerful lawyers, stood by those who had been dismissed by the system, and fought for fairness in a courtroom culture often tilted against them. Her fire was not an act, it was forged us. In the relentless experience of watching dignity denied to people simply because they lacked the privilege of power. In every case she argued, she saw echoes of her own community, and in every win she heard the quiet proof that resistance could pay off. Her decision to enter politics was not a leap into ambition, but an extension of her calling. For Crockett, the fight had never been about prestige, it was about service. It was about making sure that people who lived lives like hers were no longer invisible in the halls where decisions were made. When she won her seat in Congress, she carried her community with her, walking into a world designed to exclude her with the determination to force it open. That is why her calm silence in the face of Barr's screaming mattered, because behind that silence was every slight, every dismissal, every moment when she had been told she wasn't enough. Barr wasn't just yelling at her, he was yelling at the story of an America that refuses to shrink back, that refuses to be intimidated, that refuses to stay in the shadows. And Crockett, sitting there unshaken, embodied that refusal. Her presence was not just a personal triumph, it was a collective one. For immigrants who fought to build lives in a country that doubted them. For women who were told their voices were too loud or their ambition too dangerous. For Black Americans who had been forced to swallow disrespect for generations. Crockett was proof that dignity could endure, that strength could take shape in silence, and that calm could carry more weight than rage. And as the cameras lingered on her composed face, the nation could feel it. This was not just another politician. This was someone who had been uniquely prepared for this exact moment. She had lived the struggle that Barr had only ever observed from a distance. She had walked through the fire he thought he could summon with a shout, and that meant she had a power he could not touch. Barr's scream had been an attempt to rattle her. Instead, it had set the stage for her to show exactly why she belonged there. And when Barr unleashed his fury, it was those very struggles that armed her with the words that would shatter him. The silence that followed Barr's explosion was thick, almost unbearable. It was the kind of silence that seems to vibrate, where every second feels stretched into eternity. Barr, still flushed from his outburst, leaned back in his chair, his chest rising and falling, his glare locked on Crockett as though daring her to move. The chamber waited. America waited. Crockett adjusted her posture, slow and deliberate, her calm composure refusing to give his rage the validation he craved. The cameras caught the contrast in perfect detail. The towering figure of Barr, red-faced and visibly rattled, against the unshaken stillness of Crockett, her hands resting lightly on the table, her eyes steady and unwavering. If he had expected her to cower, he was already losing. Whispers ran through the room. Some lawmakers leaned forward, intrigued by the drama unfolding in front of them. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of whether they were witnessing a simple clash or something far bigger. Aides scribbled notes furiously, aware that this moment was going to live far beyond the walls of the chamber. On social media, the clip of Bauer's RR's scream was already trending, hashtags multiplying by the minute, but the true climax had not yet arrived. Barr, realizing the silence was stretching too long, tried to reassert himself. He muttered under his breath, shifted in his chair, adjusted his tie. The signs of a man trying to recover composure were written in every gesture, but the damage had been done. His scream had betrayed weakness, and Crockett, sitting across from him, was about to turn that weakness into his undoing. The tension built with each passing heartbeat. The chamber had become a theater, every lawmaker and spectator a captive audience. Some leaned forward, hungry for confrontation, while others braced for the collision they knew was coming. Even the cameras seemed to draw closer, capturing the beads of sweat on Barr's forehead, the quiet strength in Crockett's gaze. The clash was inevitable. Barr's explosion had demanded a response, and Crockett was not the kind of woman to let intimidation win. But what form would her response take? Would it be fiery, a matching roar to counter his scream? Or would it be something sharper, something quieter, something that cut far deeper? No one could predict what Crockett would say next, and yet the moment she spoke, the air itself seemed to change. Then it happened. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice calm, measured, and devastatingly precise. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her volume to meet Barr's. Instead, she spoke with the clarity of someone who knew that truth carries its own thunder. Her first words sliced through the silence like a blade. They were deliberate, steady, impossible to ignore. "You can scream all you want, Mr. Barr," she began, her tone unshaken. "But screaming doesn't change the facts, and it doesn't erase the truth." The chamber stirred. A murmur rippled through the audience, the kind of low collective exhale that comes when someone dares to speak the words everyone has been waiting to hear. Barr blinked, as if unsure how to respond to her refusal to match his rage. Crockett pressed on. "America has watched powerful men like you shout down anyone who dares to question them. You've built a career hiding behind volume, behind spin, behind institutions that protect you. But let me be very clear, none of that works here. Not with me, not today." Gasps echoed from the gallery. Even some lawmakers shifted in their seats, stunned by her directness. Barr's jaw tightened, but the smug certainty he had carried earlier was slipping. The cameras caught it, the flicker of doubt crossing his face, the realization that the force of his scream had not silenced her. It had amplified her. Crockett paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. Then she delivered the blow. "You want to talk about respect? Respect isn't measured by how loud you can yell, it's measured by how honest you can be. And the truth, Mr. Barr, is that your record speaks louder than your voice ever could." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Social media lit up instantly, clips of her words spreading like wildfire. Hashtags surged, tweets exploded, captions declared, "She said it, she actually said it." Barr shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching on the table, his face struggling to maintain composure. He had been expecting a defensive retreat. Instead, he was facing a counterattack that exposed his weaknesses for all to see. Crockett continued, her voice steady, her delivery flawless. She recounted his record, the selective use of power, the way he had bent the law to shield allies while dismissing accountability for corruption, the way he had consistently placed loyalty above justice. Each example landed like a hammer blow, methodical and undeniable. With every sentence, the weight of his contradictions grew heavier, pressing down on the reputation he had spent decades constructing. "You claim to defend the rule of law," she said, her eyes locked on him. "But what you've defended is privilege. You've defended corruption. You've defended power for the few at the expense of the many. And when you scream at me, you're not just screaming at Jasmine Crockett. You're screaming at every American who has ever been told to stay silent while people like you decide their future." The room went silent again. But this silence was different from the one Barr had created. This silence carried awe. It carried respect. It carried the quiet acknowledgement that history had just been made. Even Barr seemed to recognize it. His lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. His bluster had failed him. His scream had dissolved into silence, and Crockett's words now echoed louder than anything he could muster. And then came the line that would be replayed on every network, clipped into every viral tweet, etched into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Crockett leaned in, her voice calm, her gaze unbreakable, and said, "The difference between us, Mr. Barr, is simple. You believe power gives you the right to shout. I believe truth gives me the strength to stand. And today, truth wins." The chamber erupted, not with chaos but with applause, gasps, and a collective sense of release. Even those who had come in expecting another dull hearing couldn't deny the electricity of the moment. The internet exploded instantly. Reaction videos, memes, hashtags. It spread like wildfire. Barr sat in silence, his authority shattered, his scream reduced to a footnote. And as the clip spread across the internet, the reaction was immediate and unstoppable. The clip didn't just circulate, it detonated. Within minutes of the exchange, Crockett's words were cut, captioned, and posted across every major platform. On Twitter, the hashtag #Crockett Clapback surged into the trending list, racing past celebrity gossip and breaking news. TikTok users stitched the moment into reaction videos, their eyes widening, their mouths dropping open in exaggerated slow motion as her final line, "Today, truth wins," landed like a thunderclap. Instagram Reels carried the clip with bold captions, "When dignity destroys arrogance." But this wasn't just internet theater. It was cultural validation. Ordinary people texted the clip to their families. Group chats buzzed with, "You have to watch this." College students shared it in dorm lounges. Workers played it aloud in break rooms. Across the country, millions of Americans saw themselves reflected in Crockett's poise. She hadn't just silenced Barr, she had spoken for them. News outlets scrambled to keep up. Progressive commentators hailed it as a defining congressional moment of the year, calling Crockett a masterclass in composure under fire. More conservative pundits tried to spin it as grandstanding, but does. Her outrage only fueled the virality. The more they denounced her, the more her words spread. Cable panels replayed the exchange on a loop, slowing down her delivery like a sports replay, analyzing Barr's expressions frame by frame. Celebrities joined the chorus. Singers, actors, even athletes tweeted support, quoting her line about truth outlasting power. Activists turned it into a rallying cry, printing it on posters and banners. Within 24 hours, what had begun as a congressional clash had become a national conversation about dignity versus domination. Barr, once so confident in his ability to command attention, suddenly found himself sidelined. Memes painted him as a red-faced caricature, reduced to silence by Crockett's calm rebuke. His defenders tried to insist the exchange was exaggerated, but the internet had already chosen its narrative. This wasn't about spin anymore. This was about impact. The ripple effects extended into politics itself. Voters who had never paid attention to congressional hearings began looking up Crockett's speeches. Community groups invited her to speak. Donations to progressive causes spiked in her name. In living rooms across America, parents showed their children the clip and said, "See, that's what strength looks like." And yet, even as the internet burned with praise and the news cycle swirled with reactions, there was a deeper question waiting just beyond the frenzy. Because moments like these don't just vanish, they plant seeds. Seeds of inspiration, seeds of challenge, seeds of possibility. What Crockett had done was more than win a clash. She had shifted the conversation about who gets to own dignity in America. But as the applause echoed online, the true meaning of this confrontation was only beginning to unfold. The dust settled, but the resonance remained. What people carried from that chamber wasn't just the image of Barr's fury, it was the vision of Crockett's dignity. She had not met fire with fire, she had met arrogance with clarity and rage with composure. In doing so, she reminded the nation that strength isn't the loudest voice in the room, it's the one that stands unshaken when the shouting ends. Her composure became a metaphor for something larger. For years, Americans had watched political theatrics spiral into chaos, where volume replaced reason and anger substituted for truth. Crockett shattered that pattern in a single moment. She proved that dignity could disarm fury, that honesty could unravel arrogance, that calm could be revolutionary. This clash was never just about Barr and Crockett. It was about the deeper American story, the timeless struggle between justice and corruption, between courage and intimidation. Barr embodied a tradition of entitlement, the idea that power grants permission to dominate. Crockett embodied the counter-tradition, the belief that service is not about domination, but about defense. Defense of truth, defense of people, defense of the dignity that should never be negotiable. Her words, "Truth gives me the strength to stand," landed not just as a rebuttal, but as a manifesto. They reminded America that democracy is not preserved by volume, but by vigilance. They spoke to immigrants who had crossed oceans to build lives in a place that often doubted them. They spoke to women who had been dismissed as too emotional or too ambitious. They spoke to young people searching for leaders who reflected their values, and most of all, they spoke to the quiet majority who had grown weary of arrogance dominating the national stage. For them, Crockett's clapback wasn't entertainment. It was vindication. It was proof that the arc of dignity still bends upward, that arrogance can be dismantled not by matching its rage, but by refusing to bow to it. This wasn't just Crockett versus Barr. It was all of us refusing to be silenced. It was every voice that had ever been shouted down rising through her, every dismissal that had ever been endured, transformed into a moment of power. And in that transformation lay the true lesson. Arrogance can scream, but it cannot erase truth. Crockett left the chamber that day not as the underdog who had survived an outburst, but as the leader who had redefined what victory looks like. Her silence, her composure, her truth. They will echo long after Barr's shout has faded. And so we return to the title of this story. William Barr screams at Jasmine Crockett. Her viral clapback destroys him instantly. But now, you know it wasn't just about a scream. It wasn't just about a clapback. It was about a moment that revealed the difference between arrogance and dignity, between power wielded for self and strength wielded for truth. Barr thought volume would make him victorious. Instead, it exposed his weakness. Crockett showed that silence, clarity, and truth carry far more weight than rage ever could. In that chamber, in front of the nation, she didn't just win an exchange. She delivered a lesson. A lesson that arrogance may echo for a moment, but dignity echoes for a lifetime. That's why this clip is more than all content. It's a reminder of what America still longs for. Leaders who refuse to be rattled by fury, who carry their communities with them into every fight, who prove that truth is still stronger than spin. And here's where you come in. If you believe dignity should outlast arrogance, if you believe truth should always outshine volume, if you believe voices like Jasmine Crockett's deserve to be amplified, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of the movement that ensures no scream can ever silence the truth. Because today, truth won. And tomorrow, it needs you to keep it winning.